She was there before the battle began, before the first sword was raised, before the first warrior fell. She was already watching. A crow perched on a standing stone. A woman kneeling at the river's edge, washing the armor of a man who didn't yet know he was going to die. The ancient Irish didn't simply fear death, they named it, worshipped it, they gave it a face. And that face belonged to the Morrigan. A goddess so powerful, so deeply woven into the land itself that thousands of years of war, conquest, and attempted erasure couldn't silence her. She endures. She always endures. This is her story. Welcome back to Golden Cattle Media, where folklore, history, and legend intertwine. If you're new here, we explore the stories that shaped cultures, the myths that refuse to be forgotten, and the history behind why they matter. Consider subscribing if that sounds like your kind of journey. Today, we're going deep into Irish mythology and folklore to explore one of its most complex, most feared, and most endearing figures, the Morrigan. To understand the Morrigan, first you need to understand the world that created her. Picture Ireland, not the postcard version with cheerful pubs and rolling green hills, though those hills are real. Picture it before roads, before borders as we know them, before Christianity came ashore. Picture a landscape of dense forests, fog-laced bogs, and craggy coastlines where the wind sounds like something alive. This was a land of near constant conflict, tribal warfare, invasions, the struggle for sovereignty. Violence was not an exception to Irish life, it was interwoven with it. And long before the English came, long before the famines and the uprisings, the people of Ireland were already trying to make sense of death, of war, of fate. Across much of the ancient world, when people encountered forces too vast and terrifying to explain, plague, famine, war, they didn't just accept them. They personified them. They gave these forces names, forms, and stories. Ireland was no different, and out of that need to understand the darkest corners of human experience, the Morrigan was born. Our earliest written records of her come from manuscripts dating back to the 8th and 9th centuries, Irish monks preserving oral traditions that stretch back centuries before even that. But she almost certainly predates those records by a very long time. The oral tradition surrounding the Morrigan is ancient, and as we'll discover, much of it was nearly lost forever. The Morrigan, in Old Irish the name translates most commonly as the Phantom Queen or the Great Queen, is one of the most formidable figures in the entire Irish mythological tradition. She is not simply a goddess, she is a triple goddess, 3 in 1, 3 aspects of the same terrifying, awe-inspiring divine force. In modern paganism, she is often described as the maiden, the mother, and the crone. Together, they are the Morrigan, and she is not a goddess you pray to for a good harvest or calm seas. She is a goddess you encounter on the eve of war, and she is the one who decides who lives and who dies. The Morrigan is a shapeshifter, one of the most versatile in all of Irish myth. She is said to take the form of a raven, a hooded crow, an eel, a wolf, or a red-eared heifer. Each form carries meaning. The crow or raven is her most iconic shape, a bird that, even today in Ireland, carries with it the shadow of unease. A crow crying over a battlefield was not seen as a coincidence, it was understood as a sign of her presence, a sign of doom. She also appears in human form as a beautiful young woman, as a woman in the fullness of her power and authority, or as an ancient hunched crone. And it is the last form that which she terrifies, as the washer at the ford. In Irish folklore, warriors riding to battle might encounter a disturbing sight at a river crossing, a ford. An old woman, bent and weathered, kneeling at the water's edge. She is washing something, armor perhaps, or clothing, and if you look closely, and warriors dreaded looking closely, you would see that what she washes belongs to you. Your colors, your shield. To see the washer at the ford was to receive your death sentence, not a warning you might escape, a verdict already handed down. The man who saw her washing his armor would not be coming home from battle. The image, the washer at the ford, is directly connected to another figure that would haunt folklore for centuries after, the banshee. The wailing woman whose cry warned of imminent death in a household. Scholars trace a clear line between the Morrigan's most ancient form and the Banshee of later Irish tradition. She shapeshifts even through time. Her most famous mythological story involves the hero Cuchulainn, the great warrior of the Ulster cycle, Ireland's answer to Achilles. The Morrigan encounters him and offers him her love. He rejects her, which, if you know anything about mythology, is never a wise decision when it comes to divine beings. She makes his life extraordinarily difficult in the ensuing battles, tripping him as an eel, driving cattle toward him as a heifer, attacking him as a wolf. Each time he wounds her in return without knowing who she is. Later, disguised as an old woman, she asks him to drink her milk. He blesses her 3 times as he drinks, unknowingly healing the wounds he had inflicted. It's a strange, cyclical encounter. Antagonism, harm, healing, that captures something essential about what the Morrigan represents. She is not simply evil, she is something far more complicated than that. She is the force of fate itself, testing the worthy, condemning the unworthy, and deciding, always deciding, who is sovereign over the land. That brings us to something crucial. The Morrigan is not merely a goddess of death and war, she is a goddess of sovereignty. In Irish mythology, the land itself was sacred, almost alive, and the right to rule it was not just political, it was spiritual. The Morrigan, in a sense, is Ireland. She is the land made divine. To be favored by her was to be legitimate king. To be condemned by her was to fall. She is simultaneously the most frightening and the most essential figure in the Irish mythological landscape. Without death, there is no new life. Without war, there is no peace. Without judgment, there is no sovereignty. The Morrigan holds it all. The earliest written accounts of the Morrigan come from manuscripts copied in Irish monasteries during the 8th and 9th centuries. These monks were preserving oral material that had circulated for generations, possibly for centuries, before anyone committed it to parchment. It's worth acknowledging that those scribes were Christian, and some historians believe they shaped, softened, or reframed certain mythological elements through that lens. What we know less about is the folk tradition, the ground-level stories, the local beliefs, the everyday rituals and superstitions surrounding the Morrigan in rural Ireland across the following millennium. And there is a tragic reason for that gap. The Great Famine of the 1840s was not just a humanitarian catastrophe, it was a cultural one. Over 1 million people died, another million or more emigrated. A disproportionate number of those who died or were displaced were native Irish speakers, the very people who carried oral tradition, folklore, and mythological memory in their everyday language. When those voices went silent, so did an enormous amount of what they knew. There's a scholarly debate about how much of what we don't know about the Morrigan, the regional variations, the local rituals, the folk stories that never made it into manuscripts, was simply lost in those years. The famine didn't just starve people, it starved a living tradition. And yet, this is where the Morrigan story becomes almost mythological in itself. She survived. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during a period called the Irish Literary Revival, writers and scholars began deliberately excavating Irish mythology and folklore, partly as a form of cultural resistance against British rule. W.B. Yeats is the most prominent example. His work is soaked in Irish myth, including figures connected to the Morrigan. These writers understood that reclaiming the old stories was an act of reclaiming identity. The Morrigan, goddess of sovereignty and the land, became perhaps inevitably a symbol of Irish resistance. The land fighting back, the old ways refusing to die. The Morrigan's presence didn't fade with the medieval manuscripts, it seeped into the landscape itself, literally. Her importance is written into Irish geography in a way that endures to this day. In County Meath, there are 2 hills known as Dochich na Morrinia, which translates as the 2 breasts of the Morrigan, a landscape named for the goddess, connecting the physical earth to the divine feminine force believed to inhabit it. In County Roscommon, there is a Winnegat, the Cave of Cats, a narrow, cave-like entrance into the earth considered in mythology to be a portal to the otherworld and a home of the Morrigan. At Samhain, the ancient Irish festival that became what we know now as Halloween, the boundary between the living world and the otherworld was believed to be thin. A Winnegat was one of those places where that thinning felt most acutely. That connection to Samhain persists in modern practice. Contemporary pagans and devotees of Morrigan honor her during Samhain through silent suppers, meals eaten in silence in honor of the dead, lighting red and black candles, meditating on change and transformation, and offering whiskey, milk, or blood at altars. The offerings just speak to her nature, courage, sovereignty, and the willingness to face what is hard. Folk and metal musicians have long drawn on her story. Traditional ballads honor her role as a war goddess. Celtic fantasy artists return to her image again and again. The crow-winged queen, the woman at the river, the hag on the battlefield. She appears in Arthurian myth, tangled into the figure Morgan de la Fay in ways scholars continue to debate. She appears in contemporary fantasy literature and in the Dragon Age video game series, where a character named Morrigan, a shape-shifting mage of dark and ancient power, is clearly drawn from her archetype. She is, in short, everywhere. A goddess whose original worshippers are long gone, whose stories nearly vanished with the famine, whose culture was systemically suppressed for centuries, and she is still here. Still being named, still being honored, still inspiring art and fear and awe. What's striking about the Morrigan's modern resurgence is how global it has become. Devotional communities exist not just in Ireland but across the world. Online forums, local covens, solitary practitioners who feel drawn to her specifically. There is something about a goddess of sovereignty, of ownership over oneself, one's choices, one's fate that resonates powerfully in contemporary culture. Some practitioners describe their experiences deeply personal to them. Seeing crows gather unexpectedly, feeling a presence before periods of significant change or challenge, encountering her imagery in dreams. Skeptics, of course, would point to confirmation bias. We notice the crow after we've been thinking about the Morrigan, not before. But for those who practice, the distinction between symbol and presence can be razor thin. What's undeniable is this: in a world where most ancient deities have been thoroughly relegated to academic texts and museum exhibits, the Morrigan is actively worshipped. She has a living tradition. Whether you interpret that as spiritual reality, psychological symbol, or cultural continuity, the fact itself is remarkable. So what do we make of the Morrigan? Is she the divine embodiment of death and fate, a goddess whose powerful is as real today as it was in ancient Ireland? A sophisticated psychological archetype, a way of naming forces too large and terrible to confront without a face? A cultural memory encoded in stories and landscape of what it felt like to live in a world where death could come at any moment from any direction. Perhaps she is all of those things at once. The most enduring myths tend to be the ones that contain multitudes. What I find most compelling about the Morrigan is what she reveals about the people who created her. They didn't create a goddess to protect them from death, they created a goddess who was death and war and fate and sovereignty. And they worshipped her anyway. They looked at the worst of human experience directly in the eye, gave it a name, and said, "We know you. We know you are there. We will not pretend otherwise." There is something almost defiant about that. Something deeply Irish about that, in fact. People who have faced extraordinary suffering across the centuries and have consistently refused to be erased. The Morrigan, it seems, embodies that refusal as much as anything. She survived the English invasions. She survived the suppression of the Irish language. She nearly didn't survive the famine, but she did, and now, in the 21st century, she is tattooed on people's arms, sung about in metal songs, written into fantasy novels, and honored at altars with red and black candles on the night the veil grows thin. Some stories refuse to stay buried. This is one of them. So what do you think? Is the Morrigan a relic of a superstitious past, or is there something to the idea that certain archetypes are too powerful to die? Have you had your own encounter with her symbolism, or know someone who has? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey into Irish mythology and folklore, please give the video a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think. And if you're new here and you want more stories like this, folklore, histories, haunting, folk heroes, and forgotten corners of the past, we'd love to have you subscribe. Until next time, remember, history remembers, but folklore never forgets.